My name is Sarah. I am 38 years old, and I will never forget the sound of that man's cruel laughter echoing through the massive school gymnasium. It was the charity auction at my son's prestigious academy, a place where we barely fit in. I stood frozen in my cheap dress, my cheeks burning with a humiliation so deep it felt like a physical punch. Mr. Sterling, the arrogant headmaster, was at the microphone, holding up the painting I had poured my soul into. He was mocking it, telling the wealthy parents it was a sweet little $5 thrift store project, and asking if anyone would give him $10 to clear the stage. The parents chuckled, sipping champagne, looking at me with pity. I wanted the floor to swallow me. I grabbed my son's hand, tears stinging my eyes, ready to run out and never come back. But before I could take a step, a deep voice from the back of the room cut through the laughter, a voice belonging to a man who would change my entire life, shouting a number that made the entire room gasp in absolute silence. Before I tell you exactly what happened next and how that single shocking night turned my world upside down, I want to ask you something. Where are you listening to this story from? Drop your city or state in the comments below, because I really love knowing how far my experiences are reaching and connecting with people from all over the country. It helps me feel less alone in this journey.
Now, to make you truly understand the crushing weight of that night at the auction, I need to take you back to where this started. I need to explain how a struggling single mother ended up in a room full of millionaires and why that specific painting meant absolutely everything to my heart. It wasn't just canvas, it was my pain and my will to survive. My son, Leo, is 10 years old, and he is the absolute light of my life. Ever since his father walked out when Leo was a baby, it has been just the two of us against the world. I work as a waitress at a busy diner right off the highway, pulling exhausting double shifts just to keep the lights on and put cheap food on our tiny kitchen table. We live in a cramped apartment where the heater barely works, but Leo is incredibly smart. He is a truly gifted child, always reading thick books and solving complex math problems. A year ago, his teacher told me about a scholarship program for Oak Ridge Academy, the most elite private school in our city. I applied, thinking we had zero chance, but miraculously, he got in. I was so incredibly proud, crying tears of joy, but I had absolutely no idea what kind of nightmare I was stepping into by sending my boy to a school where everyone drove luxury cars. That is exactly where we first met Mr. Sterling, the headmaster of Oak Ridge Academy. He is a 55-year-old man who always wears custom-tailored suits and looks at working-class people like dirt on his expensive shoes. From the first day, he made it clear that scholarship kids like Leo were only there to make the school look good for diversity quotas.
He would give us fake smiles in the hallway, but his eyes were cold. I used to go to work feeling defeated and vent to my best friend Maya, a 39-year-old woman who works at the diner with me. Maya is the only person who truly understands my daily struggles. We would stand near the dishwashing station, and I would cry, telling her how out of place I felt. Maya would wipe my tears, give me a hug, and tell me I was working twice as hard as those rich snobs. She was my rock, but even her words couldn't protect me from the financial pressure about to hit me. A few weeks before the incident, the school sent home a gold-embossed flyer about their annual spring gala and charity auction. It was a massive event where parents were expected to donate high-end items like vacations or designer handbags to raise money for a new athletic center. The letter explicitly stated that parent participation was mandatory. I instantly panicked. I sat at my wobbly kitchen table, staring blankly at my bank account balance. I had exactly $42 to my name until my next payday, and I desperately needed that for groceries. I couldn't donate a ski trip to Aspen. I felt completely trapped. The next morning at drop-off, a group of PTA moms cornered me. One of them, a woman who always looked at me like a stray dog, loudly asked me what I was donating. I mumbled that I was figuring it out, and she smirked cruelly, saying Mr. Sterling expects a lot from the parents. I walked back to my beat-up car and sobbed. What nobody at that prestigious school knew was that I am an artist. Or at least I used to be a long time ago.
Before I got pregnant, before life got so incredibly hard, I painted constantly. I loved mixing colors and putting my raw emotions onto a blank canvas. But professional art supplies are ridiculously expensive, and when you are forced to choose between buying diapers or buying a tube of blue paint, you choose the diapers every time. So I packed my brushes away in a dusty box under my bed and promised myself I would get back to it someday. But someday never came. The only time I painted was in my head, imagining the vibrant colors of the sunset as I walked home. But sitting in my hot car that morning, feeling completely defeated, a desperate idea popped into my head. I didn't have the money to buy a fancy donation, but maybe I could make one from scratch. During my quick lunch break at the diner that day, I told Maya my crazy plan. I was so nervous that my hands were visibly shaking. I told her I was going to paint a custom piece for the school auction. Maya stopped wiping the counter, looked me dead in the eye, and smiled the most genuine smile. She's talented and that she had to do this, but I reminded her that I had no supplies and no money to buy them. After our shift, Maya drove me straight to a rundown thrift store. We dug through the dusty back aisles until we found a large blank canvas that someone had discarded. It had a tiny scratch on the back, but the front was perfect. It cost exactly $3. We then drove to a discount craft store, and I found a clearance bin with a few tubes of basic acrylic paints for $2. $5. That was my total investment.
I held that cheap canvas to my chest like pure gold. For the next 2 weeks, I barely slept. After working an exhausting 10-hour shift on my feet, I would come home, cook dinner, help Leo with homework, and tuck him in. Then I would lay down old newspapers on the table and start painting. I painted what I knew deep in my bones, a mother's tired hands holding a child's small hands. But the colors were explosive. I used deep, stormy blues to show the daily struggle and fear of not being enough. But right in the center, where the hands met, I used vibrant golds to represent the pure, fierce love for my son. I didn't have professional brushes, so I used my bare fingers and an old sponge to create thick textures. I cried so many times while I painted. I poured every ounce of my frustration into that $5 canvas. By the time I finished, it was 3 a.m. My hands were stained, but my heart felt beautifully light. I carefully wrapped the dried painting in a clean bedsheet and carried it proudly into the school's main office the next morning. Mr. Sterling was standing near the secretary's desk, sipping his artisan coffee and chatting with a wealthy father. When I walked through the glass doors, he stopped talking and raised a judgmental eyebrow. I walked up to the desk and gently placed the wrapped canvas down, announcing that this was my donation for the auction. Mr. Sterling slowly walked over, a condescending smirk playing on his lips. Without asking permission, he rudely pulled back the bedsheet.
He stared at the painting, and I held my breath, hoping he would see the deep emotion in it. Instead, he let out a harsh, dismissive scoff. He sarcastically called it colorful and mockingly asked if Leo and I did this as a weekend craft project. He stated they usually look for professional items, but he supposed they could hide it in the silent auction. I wiped a tear away and walked out. The highly anticipated night of the gala arrived. I bought a simple black dress from a second-hand shop for $10. Maya came over to my apartment to watch Leo, hugging me tight and telling me not to let anyone intimidate me. When I arrived at the massive gymnasium, I couldn't believe my eyes. There were crystal chandeliers hanging from the ceiling, tables covered in silk, and waiters in tuxedos walking around with silver trays. The other parents were dressed in designer tuxedos and custom gowns. I immediately felt like an imposter. I grabbed a glass of water and nervously walked around to find my painting. My heart violently sank when I finally saw it. It wasn't on display in the center. It was shoved all the way in the dark back corner, sitting on a cheap folding table with no lighting. Next to it was a hastily written piece of paper that simply said, "Local amateur art, starting bid, $10. I stood in the shadows, staring at it, feeling incredibly foolish. The live main stage auction started after dinner. Mr. Sterling was the auctioneer, standing on a brightly lit stage, rallying the wealthy crowd. People were casually bidding thousands of dollars on trips to Paris. The energy was electric.
Then there was a sudden lull. Mr. Sterling looked down at a piece of paper and sighed loudly into the microphone. He announced that before they got to the big items, they had a unique, low-level piece to clear out. A young assistant carried my painting to the stage. I felt all the warm blood drain from my face. Mr. Sterling held my painting up by one corner like it was a dirty rag. He spoke into the microphone, dripping with sarcasm, announcing that this lovely piece was donated by a scholarship mother. He called it a $5 thrift store canvas with messy finger painting. He begged the crowd to just give him $10 so he wouldn't throw it in the trash. The crowd erupted into roaring laughter. I stood frozen in pure public shame. I slowly turned around, hot tears blinding my vision, ready to push open the heavy double doors, run out into the night, and never show my face ever again. I was already mentally preparing to pull Leo out of the academy the very next morning. But just as my trembling hand reached the cold metal door handle, a voice boomed from the front row. It wasn't an aggressive shout, but it carried an intense authority that instantly silenced the mocking chuckles in the entire room. The voice simply said, $50,000. The massive gymnasium went completely dead silent in a fraction of a second. You could hear a pin drop. I froze entirely, my hand still resting on the handle, and slowly turned back around to face the stage. Standing tall in the front row was an older gentleman, Arthur Vance, a 60-year-old man with a neat silver beard, wearing a tailored vintage tweed suit. I had never seen him before. He had his bidding paddle raised high in the air. Mr. Sterling leaned into the microphone, blinking rapidly, his arrogant smile wiped from his pale face. He nervously stammered, asking Mr. Vance to repeat himself, assuming he had said $50. Arthur Vance slowly lowered his paddle and took a deliberate step toward the brightly lit stage, his sharp eyes locked entirely on my painting. Arthur Vance walked right up to the edge of the stage, ignoring the confused whispers rippling through the crowd. He calmly pulled a pair of reading glasses from his breast pocket, put them on, and leaned in very close to deeply examine the canvas. The silence was so incredibly heavy it felt suffocating. I didn't know exactly who this man was, but judging by the way the wealthy parents were now nervously whispering, I could tell he was someone of extreme importance. After what felt like an absolute eternity, Arthur Vance took a step back and removed his glasses. He looked directly at the headmaster. He stated very clearly that he did not say $50, addressing the headmaster by his first name, David. He reiterated his massive bid of $50,000 and boldly declared that it was a severe insult to this masterpiece to start the bidding any lower. Mr. Sterling looked like he was going to pass out. He tried to argue, begging Arthur to be reasonable, claiming it was just an amateur project, but Arthur cut him off instantly with a sharp wave of his hand.
He called the headmaster a complete fool with absolutely no eye for true art. He spoke loudly so the whole room could hear, describing the piece as magnificent. He praised the raw emotion, the brilliant texture, and the genius juxtaposition of the chaotic blues with the deep warmth of the gold. He called it profound, saying it spoke of deep struggle and fierce protective love. He declared it the best piece of contemporary artwork he had seen in a decade. A wealthy woman standing right next to me in the back of the room gasped loudly and urgently whispered to her husband that the man speaking was Arthur Vance, the legendary cheap art critic and curator for the National Gallery. She whispered that if he says a piece of art is good, it immediately becomes priceless. My tired legs felt like absolute jelly. I had to physically lean my body against the cold cinder block wall just to keep from collapsing. Arthur Vance then turned his back to the headmaster and faced the massive crowd of rich, thoroughly stunned parents. He demanded to know who the artist was, his powerful voice ringing loudly through the silent gym. Mr. Sterling, who was now visibly pale and heavily sweating under the stage lights, pointed a very shaky, reluctant finger toward the dark back of the room, pointing directly at me. The crowd of wealthy parents literally parted like the Red Sea. Hundreds of judgmental eyes that had just been looking at me with harsh mockery were now staring at me with absolute awe. Arthur Vance walked slowly down the center aisle, right up to me. He stopped, looked at my cheap dress, looked down at my permanently paint-stained fingernails, and smiled the most genuine smile. He gently extended his hand, calling me his dear, and told me that I possessed a rare gift that simply cannot be taught. He told me he was completely serious about his bid of $50,000 and politely asked if I would accept it. I couldn't even formulate a word. I just nodded my head rapidly, hot tears streaming down my face. But this time, they were tears of absolute life-changing joy. But incredibly, the miraculous night was still not over. The exact moment that a legend like Arthur Vance publicly validated my hidden talent, the entire atmosphere in the room completely shifted. Suddenly, all these snobby parents who wouldn't even give me the time of day desperately wanted a piece of the magic. A man in the back row aggressively raised his paddle and yelled out a bid of $55,000. Arthur Vance just chuckled softly, turning back to face the greedy crowd. He playfully asked if they were really going to play this game, and immediately fired back with a bid of $60,000.
Another mother, the exact same cruel woman who had mocked me in the parking lot, frantically waved her manicured hand in the air and screamed out $65,000. I stood there against the wall, utterly paralyzed, watching my $5 thrift store canvas spark an intense bidding war among the very people who had just viciously looked down on me. The numbers kept climbing, higher and higher, bouncing, echoing off the gymnasium walls.
Mr. Sterling just stood helplessly on the stage, completely useless, holding the microphone limply at his side. He was completely ignored, his fake authority entirely shattered by the sheer power of true art. Finally, Arthur Vance raised his paddle one last time with a look of terrifying determination. He shouted $80,000, explicitly stating that he absolutely refused to be outbid by anyone in that room. A heavy silence fell over the gym once again. No one else dared to raise a paddle. The painting was officially his. After the chaotic auction finally concluded, Arthur Vance pulled me aside into a quiet hallway. He handed me his thick personal business card and told me that he wanted to personally sponsor me, to help me get my very own professional art studio and set up a gallery showing in the city. He promised me that my long, painful life of struggling was officially over if I was willing to keep painting. While we were talking, Mr. Sterling nervously approached us in the hallway. He was sweating profusely, desperately trying to put on his tight-lipped smile again. He stammered awkwardly, rubbing his sweaty hands together, calling the whole thing a wonderful surprise. He then tried to smugly remind me that, as per the auction rules, all the funds go directly to the school's athletic center. Arthur Vance slowly turned to him, his kind eyes suddenly turning completely cold and hard as steel. He sharply told the headmaster that he was deeply mistaken. He clarified that the auction rules state that donations from parents are strictly voluntary, and he declared that this transaction was not a donation at all. He stated it was a private, direct sale between him and a brilliant artist, which merely happened to take place inside the school building. He firmly stated that I would be keeping every single penny of the $80,000. Mr. Sterling opened his mouth to weakly argue, but Arthur stepped aggressively closer to him. He informed Mr. Sterling that he actually sat on the highest board of directors for the academy, and that his cruel behavior tonight, publicly mocking a struggling parent, was utterly despicable. He promised Mr. Sterling that they would be having a very serious meeting about his employment future first thing Monday morning. The beautiful aftermath of that unbelievable night was exactly like waking up from a lifelong, exhausting nightmare. True to his incredibly generous word, Arthur Vance personally made sure the entire $80,000 went directly and immediately into my personal bank account. For the very first time in my son's entire life, I didn't have to obsessively worry about the electric bill getting shut off or cry over not having enough grocery money. I proudly quit my soul-crushing job at the diner, although I still make sure to go back every single week to have coffee with Maya, who cried happy tears for an entire hour when I told her exactly what had happened.
I bought brand new professional art supplies, high-quality brushes, and I set up a beautiful small studio in a bright spare room we rented in a much nicer apartment across town. As for Mr. Sterling, the board of directors did indeed hold a furious meeting that Monday. A few of the other parents who had witnessed his unhinged behavior actually spoke up against him. Mr. Sterling was quietly and forcefully asked to resign by the end of the month to avoid a massive public scandal. He packed up his custom Italian suits and left the school forever, thankfully replaced by a much kinder principal who actually values the families, regardless of the size of their bank accounts. My sweet Leo is absolutely thriving at the school now, and the other parents treat us with a genuine, polite respect that I never thought was humanly possible. Looking back on that incredibly crazy night, I realized that the most valuable thing I gained wasn't the $80,000, although that money completely and utterly changed our reality and saved our lives. The true lasting gift was finally getting my own voice and my dignity back. I learned the hard way that you should never, ever let arrogant, small-minded people define your self-worth or mock the value of your hard work. Sometimes the beautiful things we create in our darkest, most desperate moments of survival are the exact things that carry the brightest, most powerful light into the world.
I took all my heavy pain, my poverty, and my tears, and I painted it directly onto a cheap $5 canvas, and it miraculously became my ultimate salvation. Now, I want to ask you something very important from the bottom of my heart. If you were exactly in my shoes, standing in that gymnasium being publicly laughed at by everyone you knew, would you have run out the door in tears, or would you have stayed to face the fire? Let me know what you would do. Until the next story.